In January of this year, I moved out of Sydney, unable to justify paying the extortionate rent any longer. A few months before that, I received this pamphlet in my mailbox from someone who evidently had a lot of time on their hands.
Hello neighbour, do you want to see this in your backyard? Your house might be overshadowed by this proposed tower. UNSW and developer Igloo have proposed a large tower development at the car park adjacent to Neighbour on Anzac Parade.
Oh no! We're going to lose this beautiful car park?
It includes 2 buildings which are between 19 and 23 stories or 76 metres tall. These buildings will substantially impact the sunlight to your property, the view from your yard and your privacy in your outdoor spaces when they are constructed.
Now look, all of these claims are pretty easily disprovable. See, what the building will overshadow is the UNSW Regiment Army base just behind me here, which famously lets in lots of sunlight through its wide, generous windows. It will also overshadow some suburban detached housing that is beyond these trees you can see behind me, which already overshadow this housing. Now, I was lucky enough to have a courtyard in my rental in Sydney, but I didn't really care if people saw me while I was sitting outside. I mean, I wasn't doing anything illegal or naked. That was for indoors. But you know what? I think these pamphlets are more geared towards landlords anyway. So even if they do want a bit of extra privacy in their backyard, you know what they can do? Just plant some more trees.
The people behind this leaflet are called NIMBYs, which stands for Not in My Backyard, and while often they will support more housing or public transport, often it's only nowhere near them.
Often they use heritage and the environment to support their claims, but that's something that they couldn't get away with for this development, considering it's, you know, in a car park. If you want a video that disproves some common NIMBY arguments, check out Zach's video over at his channel City Connections.
So what motivates NIMBYs? The simple answer is property values. While traffic may be another valid concern, this doesn't necessarily make sense in relation to the recent upzonings around train stations that the government's been doing. So for this video, we'll be focusing just on property values.
Property prices are influenced by a lot of different things, such as the availability of social housing, for example. But one key factor in the price of homes is supply and demand. Is there enough housing supply to meet the demand? Generally, when supply is restricted but demand goes up, so does the price of housing. And this is not good for people looking for an affordable rental or looking to enter the housing market, but it is good for people who already own homes or are landlords coveting that sweet, sweet capital gains tax concession.
How do we fix this? Well, intercity international migration is a factor, but you can't play around with it without potentially causing some serious economic impacts. If you want to see this, see Shara's video on immigration as an example.
Supply is one important lever we have to solve the housing crisis. This is shown pretty clearly by the city of Auckland in New Zealand. They upzoned in 2016, and since then, rents and house prices there have grown more slowly than the rest of New Zealand, and they've been less sensitive to changes in interest rates. I mean, just look at this beautiful graph.
So you can see why people who are invested in the continued growth of their property value would otherwise oppose new housing. But then you have to ask why progressive political parties like the Greens, who support valid solutions to the housing crisis, like social housing minimums and abolishing tax concessions for landowners, would oppose this solution to the housing crisis.
When discussing the New South Wales government's transit-oriented development plan, Kobe Shetty, Balmain member for the Greens, said this: "It was incredibly disappointing to see Inner West Labor councillors ignore community concerns, read NIMBY concerns, and instead choose to prioritise developer profit under what is a fundamentally unsustainable, poorly planned rezoning proposal." Despite the fact that higher density is more sustainable because it leads to less car dependency, we urgently need action on the housing crisis, but the wholesale rezoning proposal put on the table by New South Wales Labor will not achieve that. As far as I know, there is no evidence that rezoning will not make housing more affordable, and plenty of evidence, including Auckland, that says that it will.
So despite the misinformation in his statement, you can see why otherwise progressive parties, like the Greens, would side with money-hungry landlord NIMBYs. It's to spite developers. And
this is understandable. You see, Sydney has had a long history of developers doing the wrong thing. And to fully understand this history, we have to go back to the 60s. The 1960s, when the QVB was almost demolished to make way for more car parking. and some of Sydney's most beautiful and adored structures like the Car Hill Expressway were built.
Welcome to Footpaths and Corner Stores. My real full name is Chris Topher. Make sure to subscribe to demolish your city's CBD for surface parking.
From the mid-1960s, the building union became increasingly concerned with matters of town planning. It persistently criticised the boom in office block development and predicted an oversupply in office space in the coming years, as well as continued destruction of the natural environment.
And the building union was right to block construction. I mean, Sydney is currently dealing with quite the oversupply of office space, which is, yes, in part because of an increase in working from home due to COVID, but also because of a massive increase in supply over the last few years.
This is similar to the issue the construction union predicted in the 1960s when it pleaded, instead of the construction of office buildings, for the construction of socially useful projects. Too much office space not only makes for expensive housing, but dead, boring places. Just look at North Sydney. Outside the 9 to 5, it's basically abandoned. The main shopping centre is literally closed on Sunday, making it a glorified business park.
So what socially useful projects did the union want to build? Hospitals, schools, other public utilities, high quality flats, units and houses, provided they are designed with adequate concern for the environment. Though they wanted all their members employed, they did not want to become just robots directed by developer builders who valued the dollar at the expense of the environment. The New South Wales Builders and Labourers Federation would use their green bans always in support of those most urgently in need of quality housing.
The green bans famously started in Kelly's Bush in 1970, where developer A.V. Jennings attempted to build several apartment blocks on the last remaining bushland on Sydney Harbour. After being disregarded by the council, the locals reached out to the union, who placed a black ban on the project.
In the end, the union won and the development was stopped. What was pretty unique about this situation is that you had a workers' union working together with a group of concerned citizens in a relatively wealthy area, and they had a common goal, which was the preservation of the environment.
Eventually, these would shift towards social housing and heritage preservation, with one of the most famous green bans being at Woolloomooloo, home to maritime workers and fishermen, which would have been turned into high-rise office blocks, skyscraper hotels, and parking lots.
Thanks to a green ban placed in February 1973 on the entire suburb and not lifted until early 1975, 65% of the area was retained by the Housing Commission for low-income earners, under a plan that entailed a genuine socio-economic mix of residents living in medium-density buildings with many trees and landscape surroundings.
With an average weekly rent of $490, Woolloomooloo is still relatively affordable, relatively when compared to neighbouring areas like Paddington at $590 per week. And this is largely due to the high rate of social housing. That's how powerful the effect of the ban was. Its after effects are still being felt today, despite the relative underinvestment in social housing nowadays.
But the construction union wasn't fighting just anyone.
The Green Ban movement came into serious contention with Sydney's criminal underworld, as the ban sought to preserve working class residences in Victoria Street, King's Cross. The proposed redevelopment in the area was mostly geared towards the higher income residential market, and most of the area was bought up by developers like Frank Thiemann. As such, the area was placed under a green ban by the BLF in April of 1973.
However, armed thugs vandalised Thiemann-owned buildings earmarked for demolition and terrorised the residents. One green ban activist disappeared and returned too frightened to say what had happened to him, and another, Juanita Nielsen, disappeared on the 4th of July 1975. Her body has never been found. The lifting of the green ban meant that the area did not retain a significant proportion of low-income housing stock, as intended in the placing of the ban.
There was also the ghost train fires in Luna Park, where 7 were killed after the riot was set ablaze by bikie gangs. Evidence links Abe Saffron, known by the very cool and definitely not stripper-coded nickname Mr. C, to the fire. F*** off, that was not... He sounds like a f***ing like villain from like a Christian kids cartoon.
The King's Cross gangster who built an empire on illegal gambling, prostitution, liquor and property was said to have long coveted the Luna Park land on Sydney Harbour, which is owned by the state government. After the fire, the company that won the tender for Luna Park was run by Saffron's nephew, Sam Cowper, and Saffron's Arcadia Gaming Machines company also had 100 machines installed at the fun fair.
Developers are still linked to organised crime to this day. A member of the Alameddine gang was even arrested for firebombing Jordan Shanks' house after Shanks made a video exposing John Barilaro's shady hiring at the company coronation.
There's also Gene Nassif who runs Toplace, and he's currently on the run from police overseas after committing massive fraud and leaving a bunch of defective buildings in his wake.
Last year in 2023, 2 gangsters were even arrested for large-scale fraud. They hadn't developed anything yet, but they own land purchased for a new suburb owned and developed by Chinese organised crime near Sydney's new international airport.
You can really see how these NIMBYs would think that stopping these developments and hurting the profits of these criminal groups would be a really good way to fight the criminal element, especially the Greens, who, were largely formed during the Tasmanian environmental movement, but they also have their roots strongly in New South Wales green bans. But we can't just ignore the other side of the coin.
Landlords. They regularly flout livability standards and rent out legally uninhabitable properties at high prices. This is only possible because of just how desperate the housing crisis has people for a place to live. For an example of this, all you have to do is spend 5 minutes looking at shitrentals.org.
Tasteful renovations have taken this mid-century gem and turned it into a thoroughly contemporary family home. Come down and see for yourself at an open inspection and experience our service that has won us of the year for 3 years running.
I've personally lived in multiple apartments that didn't meet the legal livability standards. Apartments with constantly damp foundations, inadequate ventilation, mold problems, German cockroach infestations, the list goes on. And the landlords have always refused to bring these places up to minimum standards for livability, even when I got fair trading involved.
The success of these criminal landlords is in part due to NIMBY groups. When property supply is artificially restricted, those who own all the property can basically get away with whatever they want.
Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that the NIMBYs are not working class, so they cannot genuinely advocate for working class values like the Builders Union could. You see, to be a NIMBY, not in my backyard, you have to have a backyard. And to be settled enough in a community that you can go to these council meetings, you generally have to own property. And if you own property in Sydney, especially Eastern Sydney, you're probably a millionaire, right? The massive amounts of low density residential zoning means that there are basically 2 types of developers who can be successful. Developers who are big enough to build an entire new greenfield suburb, or developers who are big enough to get their fingers all in politics. Friendly reminder that John Barilaro got a job at Coronation right after leaving as Deputy Premier, and therefore these developers know how to manipulate the planning system to get occasional parcels of land upzoned to build massive towers that are really profitable.
Blanket upzoning to medium density makes it easier for small developers to get in on the property market, which creates fewer opportunities for large developers controlled by criminal gangs to exploit the housing crisis for their own gain.
Ultimately, the green bans were a way for Sydney's working class to fight for their values. For the union supporters in the wider public, the green bans became a symbol of working class radical potential. Low-cost housing, public transport, tenants' rights, and even prisoners' rights and urban Aboriginal land rights. The only overlap between them and the typical modern NIMBY is that they both fight for values. The main difference being that the NIMBY fights for their home's value. For an approach that really serves the needs of the people, we need movements formed of those people, workers and everyday folk. Sydney YIMBY is a great example of that kind of movement. Although often it gets, comments thrown around, people accusing it of being a group of developer shills. When I've gone to Sydney YIMBY meetings, I've met groups of people displaced by a kind of new gentrification, whereby property prices increasing as the buildings stay the same means that the demographics shift to being older and wealthier. Sydney YIMBY also vets all of their members to make sure that there are no ties to developers.
Fighting for more housing is important, but we need to make sure that the housing is good quality, the renting experience is dignified, and there is more social housing to go with it. That's where groups like the Tenants Union come in. They support zoning reform, as well as renter-specific rights, such as eliminating no-grounds evictions. Parties like the Greens also do important work in this area, but they're compromising on this with their NIMBY elements.
We can fight for more public transport and bike lanes to be built as well. Both of these things improve housing affordability because it means you don't have to store a car on your property, right? And in Sydney, the average car space adds $100,000 to the cost of a property. Traffic is also an oft-cited NIMBY reason to not build any new housing. And when there are more ways to get around than just driving, that argument kind of loses its power. And if the green bans were around today, I would bet that bike lanes would be on their agenda, since it's one of the best bang for your buck pieces of infrastructure for lowering carbon emissions. Active transport also provides an affordable way for workers to get around. You can join and support organisations like Better Streets to support more livable, less car-centric public spaces that are ready to welcome more housing.
But we need to take a leaf from the NIMBY book and fight against things too. That means running together, but excessive amounts of new office buildings, or greenfield development, or new urban freeways.
More housing is important, but it shouldn't come at the cost of agricultural land, floodplains, or natural habitat.
That's another reason that upzoning detached single-family home-only areas is a good solution. It doesn't sacrifice any of those things.
Ultimately, it's not the aesthetic or the name of the movement that's important. Sure, it might feel like sticking it to the man when you're fighting the developers at every turn, but when we're finding a solution for the housing crisis, we've got to come at it from the perspective of values and make sure we stick to those values. You know, values like equality, because ultimately that's what the housing debate is all about. And we've also got to incorporate other values, environmentalism, solidarity with the people who are bearing the brunt of housing affordability problems. And it's only when we truly stick to these values that we'll find a real solution to the housing crisis.